Hello class and welcome back. This lecture is going to cover extinction for operant conditioning. So we've already talked about extinction in the context of Pavlovian conditioning, and that is when you have a CS that's repeatedly presented without the accompanying unconditioned stimulus. So something similar can happen in operant behavior, in which following a particular behavior in which an organism emits, you omit the reinforcer or punisher, so you stop providing that. And then just as we saw with Pavlovian conditioning, we'll see extinction of the operant behavioral response where it will decrease. However, it does have a couple of interesting kinds of caveats that's worth talking about. So what I'd like you to take home from this lesson is to be able to define appropriately what is extinction, what happens to the contingency in extinction, what side effects do you see during extinction, and how can those side effects be reduced. Also, what influences how long extinction will take, or an example of resistance to extinction. So extinction refers to two things. First is a procedure. So this is something like a procedure in which you are the operator in a way. So this is, there's a behavior that you want to reduce. So you will implement extinction as a procedure. So this is going to be the withholding of reinforcement for previously reinforced behaviors. It's also defined necessarily as the process. So whether you are implementing or planning to implement extinction doesn't really matter. There's the sort of behavioral process or the effect on behavior, which is the decrease in previously reinforced behavior when reinforcement no longer occurs. So one of the great examples that we see quite frequently with pet dog owners and their dogs is that they train their dog to do a particular behavior like sit or go to bed or something to that effect. And then once the dog starts doing it successfully and they're giving them a treat every single time, they decide, okay, my dog knows it now. So now I don't need to continue giving them a treat for doing it because they know what to do. And essentially what that concept is basically extinction. I've trained this behavior to be reinforced with food, and now I will stop giving them food. And typically what you see is the behavior breaks down, they stop doing it, and owner may say, I don't understand what's wrong with my dog. He knows what to do, he just won't do it because he's stubborn, right? Sort of getting into the circular explanations. But in reality, all that's happening is extinction, and it's a natural phenomenon that we would have predicted and expected because you stopped reinforcing that particular behavior. So extinction demonstrates that pretty much all of the reinforcement properties that it has on behavior are temporary, so they can basically be gone. Only under only certain circumstances in which a behavior might be reinforced a few times does it continue, and those are going to be cases where you're training an individual to contact some type of natural contingency or something like that. Or say, for example, I wanted to train my dog to operate a ball launcher or something like that, right? You may initially train them to bring the ball to the ball launcher with food, and then to put the ball into the ball launcher with food, and then you stop reinforcing, but the behavior continues because even though your reinforcer of food is gone, it's now contacting the contingency of they get the ball thrown by the ball launcher every time they put the ball in. So it's just kind of changing the contingency in that situation. But pretty much under all typical cases, if you stop reinforcing a behavior that you've trained, it will stop working, or the behavior will stop. So if, for example, I said for the rest of this class that I will be teaching no more material, I will be giving you no more information, I will be giving no further grades, what's the probability that you will continue to show up, right? If there's nothing there, or just to an empty room just because, right? You're not going to do that because the reinforcers are no longer there. So it's the termination of a contingency. So respondent will no longer reliably produce the reinforcer. This does not just happen because of the passage of time. This is important because it's not the same as forgetting. So this would be different than forgetting. So say if I train my dog to sit when I say sit, and they do it quite reliably. If I just waited 2 days or waited a week, or if I went on a 2 weeks vacation and I came home and I said sit, my dog would still sit. That's not a problem. That would be an example of just the passage of time, and a lot of times what we call forgetting. On the contrary, if during that entire 2-week period, I would say sit, my dog would sit, and then I would not give them a reinforcer, that's a completely different and fundamentally different process. That process is extinction, and is very different than simply just a decrease in behavior because of the passage of time. So the main effect of extinction is going to be to see a decrease in the response rate, but we also see lots of side effects. We don't just see a simple decrease in response rate. We see what we call extinction burst, extinction-induced variability, extinction-induced emotional behavior. So extinction burst is basically when extinction initially starts taking place, you'll typically or frequently see an increase in that behavior first before it starts to decrease. So this would be a good example, like your Coke machine, right? Perhaps you put in some money, you push the button, and a Coke doesn't come. So then you might push the button 20 times or 15 times or something really quick because you're going to try again and try again. And then you will then have a complete decrease in behavior thereafter because it's still not working. The extinction burst is a temporary increase in responding that comes initially when extinction is implemented. Extinction-induced variability means that you typically will try different kinds of behaviors. So the book pointed to a famous study in which nose poking rats. But in a real life situation, this might be something like, going back to your Coke machine, you might try hitting the Coke machine on the side. You might try rocking the Coke machine. You might try unplugging it and plugging it back in. This is variation in your behavior that's caused because of extinction. And we see the same thing with our dogs. If you were to say sit and stopped reinforcing it after you reinforce it for a while, then maybe they might try lying down. Maybe they'll try spinning in a circle. Maybe they will try barking. You'll start seeing variation in their behavior because it's undergoing extinction. And then also with that, you typically see significant emotional behavior and responding. So some of the initial studies that was looking at this found that when you put an animal on extinction, particularly like a pigeon in an operant chamber, and you put 2 pigeons in there. So one pigeon is kind of in room 1, another pigeon is typically working by pecking a key for food. You put that pigeon on extinction, then you see increased sort of fighting responses and emotional behavior. They will start engaging in wing flapping or pecking the other pigeon that just happens to be in there because that one pigeon is undergoing extinction. It can be highly emotional. It can be quite frustrating when extinction is occurring, which is why it's really important that if we're thinking this as a potential behavioral or training tool, that we think of ways to try and reduce especially these kinds of side effects of extinction. So the extinction burst is a temporary response, an increase in response rate following the withdrawal of reinforcement. This might be, a child asking, "Can I have this?" And you say no. They might ask again and again and again before they stop asking, or pushing your button again with your Coke machine or vending machine example. Or if you ask your dog to paw and you put out your hand and they paw you and you don't give them a treat, they might try pawing again and pawing again and pawing again and pawing again, all different kinds of things. These are examples of extinction bursts. So when extinction is implemented, behavior frequently will get worse before it gets better. You'll see an actual spike in behavior. It's quite important not to reinforce during these bursts, especially if you're purposely trying to decrease the behavior. So if you wanted to decrease some behavior like barking to get food or something like that, the first thing that you're going to see is that the barking will go up once you start implementing extinction. If you give in then into your extinction process and go ahead and give your dog food, then you've essentially ended up incidentally, or you didn't mean to, but you end up reinforcing more extreme sort of topographies of the behavior than before. So now the animal is not just learning that I need to bark to get my food, I have to bark really loud or a lot of times to get food. This is particularly important and ends up being a bad situation that can happen when we're trying to extinguish a lot of, I don't know, like biting or chewing kinds of behaviors, and we're not providing any type of alternative for the dog to do. So we're trying to extinguish the reaction that a dog might get out of you by nibbling towards you, things like that. You put it on extinction, well, the first thing that's going to happen is it's going to get worse. The biting or the puppy nipping might get even stronger. And then what's going to happen is that if you then sort of respond to the even stronger nips, essentially you've just trained them that they have to bite harder to get a response or a reaction out of you rather than lighter. So one, it's important to try and avoid this altogether, and we'll talk about ways to do that. But two, if you do go through this route and end up seeing the extinction burst, it's really important not to reinforce during these bursts. Because if you just get through that sort of hump, then it will start extinguishing appropriately and the behavior will decrease. You can also see significant emotional induced responding. So yelling, crying, flapping. I talked about the pigeon with the aggressive responses. So crying in children under extinction. You might get upset if you start putting up some Facebook posts and they stop liking it. So that would be extinguishing your post, but it might cause emotional responding to yourself. And then again, with the fax machine, maybe some of you have seen Office Space, or this picture might be getting too old and I need to update it with a different movie. But anyway, the fax machine never worked, and then they essentially destroy it through emotional responding. So to try and prevent extinction side effects, the key is to try and give the person or animal that you're working on another way to access the reinforcer that you are eliminating. So if the reinforcer is food, then try and provide another behavior that the animal can engage in to get the same amount of food. If the reinforcer is attention, so like for example, your child is crying for attention, then the appropriate way to put that under extinction would be to, before you start that, train or teach your child to be able to request, can I have your attention, please? Or can I ask you a question, please? In an appropriate way so that they can learn to get your attention through an alternative way while you put the other one on extinction. And that will significantly reduce the types of extinction burst respondings that we see. The same could be for our dog if you're working on jumping up when you come through the door. If they're doing it to get attention, and now you want to put that on extinction so you don't give them attention when they jump up, you will probably see significant jumping up to begin with. That's an extinction burst, followed by emotional responding. But if you give them an alternative, like if you teach them to sit for attention beforehand, then when you're implementing that under extinction, they have an alternative behavior they can engage in, like sitting, that you can then reinforce with the attention. So they still have the same access to the attention. It's just now you're shifting behavior from one type to another that might be more appropriate and easier to manage. So typically we recommend never using extinction alone, always using it in conjunction with some type of positive reinforcement. So if child is crying, it's maintained by attention as the reinforcer. If you're going to put crying on extinction, teach the child an alternative way to get your attention or to access it other than simply through crying. So extinction is an inevitable effect of ceasing reinforcement, but it can occur at very different rates. So if you stop reinforcing a behavior, it will decrease no matter what, but how quickly it decreases will depend on the way that you've trained it and the conditions that behavior was being reinforced. So that is, some responses are more resistant or resilient to extinction. So in general, behaviors that have a long history of reinforcement tend to be more resistant to extinction. So if your dog has been jumping up on you every single day that you've come home and has been getting attention for the last 4 years, the second you try and implement extinction, it's not going to stop. It's going to continue because it has what we call more behavioral momentum. And the book does a good job talking about behavioral momentum theory in the chapter because it's been previously reinforced for a much longer period of time. But There's also kind of a caveat of what we call a partial reinforcement effect. So if a behavior was previously reinforced under an intermittent schedule of reinforcement, especially versus a continuous schedule of reinforcement, it tends to be more resistant to extinction. So think about you playing a slot machine, right? That was our example previously of a variable ratio schedule. How would you know that that slot machine is broken if the lights were still flickering, but the break was just that it would never provide a jackpot? It would probably take a really long time to be able to determine that there was something broken with the machine, that it was under extinction, right? Because you had already learned to expect that your probability of a payoff was going to be low on any given trial. But you were okay with that because you'd previously been trained that, after every so many types of responses, you'll occasionally get a win. So if instead you were going to a Coke machine, how long would it take for you to know that there's something wrong with the Coke machine? And probably the answer is right away, right? If you put your money in, you push the button and nothing happens, you've already figured out that the Coke machine is broken. But your slot machine, on the other hand, if you put your money in, you press the button, and you don't get a win, you don't know that it's broken yet. You've got to do it another 5,000 times. And if it still doesn't do it, then you might be a little suspect, like, hey, I think this machine might be broken. So that's basically the underlying effect of the partial reinforcement effect. If you're under a more intermittent schedule of reinforcement, then it's going to be much harder for the animal to be able to determine that they're under extinction. So in other words, they would have already learned to expect on many trials that they're not going to get paid, such that if you have to use extinction or they're undergoing extinction for some reason, it will take longer for them to essentially be able to determine that the frequency of the non-reinforced trials is higher than expected and getting closer to extinction. So intermittent reinforcement tends to create greater resistance to extinction. So continuous schedules of reinforcement, every response is reinforced. Intermittent, remember, is only some of those instances are reinforced. And then this highlights the comparison I just made of it would be a lot easier to figure out that your snack machine is broken than would be your slot machine. So under these cases, your slot machine is going to be more resistant to extinction. So if you broke the slot machine so it doesn't give you a payoff versus breaking the Coke machine or the vending machine such that it doesn't dispense the Coke, you will continue to respond on the slot machine longer. So we said the partial reinforcement likely occurs because it's more difficult to discriminate that reinforcement has stopped because you have previously produced responses not always followed by reinforcement. Another thing that influences how quickly extinction happens is previous experience with extinction. So the more experience an animal has with extinction under the same kinds of context, typically the faster it occurs. So if you've extinguished a particular behavior under a particular context in the past, and then it has come back for one particular reason or another, then when you re-implement extinction, it will tend to go faster. So here we would say typically that S delta is trained or that there's a stimulus indicating that you are under extinction conditions, so that they learn that there's essentially a new contingency that if this kind of conditions are in place, then it's unlikely that I'm going to get paid or reinforced. So in this case, this can quite readily happen for our dogs in that if you have a treat pouch that you use for training every single day, and you're working with your dog, training them in this particular context, and you always bring in your treat pouch with you, and now you take them out for a walk, expecting great behavior, but you didn't leave it in, but you left your treat pouch at home, that lack of treat pouch would be essentially an S delta or a signal to the dog that, hey, I'm not going to get reinforced now. So essentially all of that behavior is probably going to go out the window because now it's indicating that extinction conditions are under effect, and that if they walk to heel when you ask them to walk to heel, they're never going to get paid for that because the pouch is gone. The same can be is that the pouch can be a discriminative stimulus to indicate that, yes, I am going to get paid. So if you ever say like, oh, my dog is perfect when I bring treats, but he's not when I don't bring treats, because they know that you have treats, and that's a really strong SD or an S delta for whether they're going to get them or not, right? If they notice that you don't have any treats, then obviously they know that they're not going to get any, and that becomes a very strong extinction stimulus to indicate that all of your previously reinforced behaviors are currently under extinction. So you tend to see very fast extinction under those cases. Importantly, extinction is always temporary. We talked about spontaneous recovery under Pavlovian conditioning, and the same is true here. So behavior that has undergone extinction will return if the stimulus context changes. Resurgence is a reappearance of a previously reinforced response when a more recently reinforced response is extinguished. So if you had your dog that was jumping up and engaging in some other behavior, maybe we'll just say circling, was jumping up and circling, you address the jumping up issue by providing reinforcement for some alternative behavior, but they're still circling a little bit. So now you want to put that under extinction. When you put that under extinction, it wouldn't be uncommon to see the jumping up come back or any types of responses come back. We can see this resurgence and sort of reinstatement are things that are quite common within sort of the drug addiction literature, because we think that these are things that happen quite frequently in the cases of relapse with drugs and narcotics. Reinstatement is basically, I don't think I have it on this slide, is essentially when a reinforcer is kind of presented just without necessarily the behavior, and then you see the previously extinguished response reoccur. A lot of times we'll call all of these and lump these together under what we call sort of relapse paradigms. And interestingly, things like our social media and Facebook, I've noticed, because I'm one of those that kind of like sign up for a little bit and then just completely forget about it for a long period of time. And interestingly, I've noticed that Facebook is a really good behavioral scientist in terms of reinstatement, in the sense that if I had signed in and looked at something and there's been a long time since I've signed in, they'll send me an email or attach me some other way and say, hey, you got some likes while you were away. Why don't you check this out? Or, hey, there's this post that we think you might like. And essentially what that's doing is that my previously reinforced behavior of checking Facebook and seeing what was going on had kind of disappeared. It had decreased, perhaps through an extinction process. And now they're just going to deliver me the reinforcer through my inbox. And essentially that reinforcer that kind of pops up like, oh, you got some likes, is going to sort of resurge my initial behavior of going onto Facebook and checking. So in terms of applied significance, these types of things happen all the time in terms of reinforcement of behaviors and undergoing extinction. So typically with children, right, when they're throwing a tantrum for ice cream, you can reinforce a tantrum to get them to stop. We sort of already gave those examples in terms of negative reinforcement. And say, for example, a therapist teaches the mom to try and ignore those tantrums when they're occurring and try and reinforce asking nicely for the ice cream, like, may I please have the ice cream, would get them ice cream. So you're reinforcing an alternative behavior, asking nicely, while at the same time putting the tantrum under extinction. But let's say, for example, the child finds it easier just to say, give me ice cream, without being nice about it. And then you decide, I don't care, that's fine. And you stop reinforcing the nice behavior, you will typically see a tantrum return, which would be an example of resurgence in this case. And then if you incidentally reinforce those sort of resurgence events, then it will recover quite quickly and strongly. The resistance to extinction is something that we've been kind of interested in our dogs, because persistence tends to be something that we're interested in for working dogs. In other words, how long will they continue to work, especially under cases in which they may not be getting reinforced. One of the things that we were interested in was trying to measure this. We had a whole study looking at resistance to extinction and their ability to learn an odor detection task. I just wanted to pull out some of the things from that research project, and the paper's online. You can read it and download it if you were interested. But nonetheless, I wanted to kind of highlight how some of these things that we're talking about are actually going into recently published research, and is still kind of an active thing and not something old and archaic. So here is a cumulative record. We just talked about cumulative records in our last class, right? And this is basically time, and these are increased upticks with each response that a dog makes. So this is Comet making lots and lots of responses over a short period of time. And this is sort of an initial acquisition phase. where it goes up to 30 responses. Then when 30 responses finishes, he's getting reinforced for each of these. We then put Comet under extinction, and you can see that Comet makes lots and lots and lots of responses under extinction and continues going for a long period of time. Whereas Zeus, a comparative sort of animal, shows a very similar kind of acquisition pattern, super strong in responding. Then we put them under extinction. They sort of recognize that extinction is occurring much, much faster, and then stops responding. Interestingly, we found that this pattern, the Zeus pattern here, was actually the dogs that were most apt to learning the odor detection task. And we think it's perhaps because Zeus here is much more sensitive to identifying what the reinforcement contingency is in effect. In other words, he was much more quickly able to recognize that I'm not going to get anything, whereas Comet, it appears that it took him much longer to try and recognize whether he was going to find something or not. And this is kind of an example of the types of things that we can do with lever pressing. So this is an FR schedule that Tuffy is working on here. This is really just to highlight that the same types of stuff that we are talking about in day-to-day basis, or sort of in these lectures, are things that are being implemented in terms of research on a day-to-day basis. So these things are sort of current and relevant, even though it may not seem so. But anyway, so the take-home points for today's lecture, quickly again, and what is extinction, which is termination of the reinforcement contingency. So that's when the behavior occurs, the reinforcer or punisher no longer occurs. Under these conditions, so what happens to the contingency in extinction? The contingency is basically disrupted. You see the contingency essentially stop or be removed. And it's not the same as forgetting. It's not that there's just a gap in time. It's that you're actually breaking the association between the behavior and the reinforcer connection. What side effects do you see during extinction? So we talked about emotional responding. We talked about variability in responding, as well as an extinction burst. How can those side effects be reduced? The main way was providing an alternative source of reinforcement for the reinforcer that you are putting, or the reinforcer that was previously accessed through the behavior you're putting under extinction. So things like teaching them a more appropriate request, or teaching them an alternative behavior that allows them to get that reinforcer, instead of necessarily just putting something under extinction. What influences how long extinction will take, or resistance to extinction. And we talked about the partial reinforcement extinction effect, which is that intermittent schedules of reinforcement tend to be more resistant than others, but also the longer the history of reinforcement, or the more times that an animal's been reinforced for that behavior in the past, also is an important key, and that the more reinforcement that they've had in the past for that particular behavior will make it even more resistant to extinction. So that sort of takes away our key points for extinction, and I will see you soon. Thank you.